You ever buy something thinking it's gonna bring you peace, only to find out it comes with a full-time headache? Yeah. That's how I ended up at war with an HOA. See, I didn't buy a house in some fancy subdivision. I bought land, wide, open, dusty land. About 40 acres of it. The kind of place where the wind hums through the fence line, and the only traffic noise you hear is a cow sneezing 2 miles away. It was quiet. Peaceful. Mine. When I first signed the papers, I remember standing out there at sunset, watching the sky burn orange over the hills. I told myself, this is it. No neighbors. No rules. No nonsense. I'd spent years in the city dealing with barking dogs, parking tickets, and nosy people who act like your mailbox is a community meeting spot. I swore I'd never live under anyone's rules again. Fast forward a few years, and guess what? People followed me. They built a subdivision just down the road, cookie-cutter houses lined up like they were printed from a template. You know the type, every lawn perfectly trimmed, every mailbox identical, every house painted some approved shade of beige. And of course, where there's conformity, there's an HOA. At first, I didn't think much of it. Their little neighborhood was technically separate from my property. I figured they'd stay in their world, and I'd stay in mine. But apparently, freedom makes some people uncomfortable, especially when they can see it from their window. My land borders a shared access road that cuts between my property and the new development. It's been there since before I even moved in. Dirt road, gravel patches, one old wooden gate I built myself just to keep my cattle from wandering where they shouldn't. Simple. Practical. Then one day, I get a letter in the mail. It's from the HOA. Not addressed to neighbor, not even property owner. No, this thing starts with Dear Violator. Violator. Like I'm running an illegal chop shop out here instead of raising cattle. The letter says my gate is an unauthorized structure that obstructs HOA maintained access. And I'm sitting there thinking, what HOA? I didn't sign up for one. Turns out, when the subdivision expanded, their little board decided the shared access road technically fell under community jurisdiction. Meaning, in their minds, I was now part of their fiefdom. That's when I started digging into the paperwork. I pulled out my deed, the property maps, the county records. Everything I owned said private land. I wasn't even in their subdivision boundary. But apparently, their president, a guy named Doug, who, by the way, drives a golf cart like it's a police cruiser, decided my land was subject to review. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read plain English. And the only thing my deed said about shared access was that the road was for agricultural and emergency use. That's it. No mention of a homeowners association, no mention of board approval. So I called them up. Figured I'd be polite. Hey, this is John, the rancher down by the old creek road. I got a notice about my gate? Doug's voice comes through the speaker, all sharp and officious. Yes, sir, we're aware of that. The board has determined your gate is non-compliant with community standards. I said, community standards? Doug, the only community standard out here is, don't spook the cattle. He didn't laugh. Instead, he told me I had 14 days to remove it or face fines. Fines? For a gate on my own land. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with nosy neighbors. I was dealing with people who thought they could control everything they laid eyes on even if it wasn't theirs. I'll admit, at first I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they just sent the notice to the wrong address. But nope, a few days later, one of their board members actually showed up. Drove up my road like they owned the place. Clipboards in hand. Measuring tape. Taking pictures of my gate. That's when the tone shifted. This wasn't just annoying, it was personal. Because I built that gate with my own 2 hands. Cut the lumber, welded the hinges, hung it myself. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. It was part of my land, part of my routine. And now these suburban overlords wanted to take it down because it didn't fit their aesthetic. As I stood there watching them snap pictures, I remember thinking, I bought this land to get away from people. Not to answer to a board full of them. That was the day the line got drawn. They wanted my gate gone. I wanted my peace back. And neither of us had any idea just how far this fight was about to go. You ever notice how the smallest things start the biggest fights? Well, in my case, it was a gate. Not some high-tech, fancy, remote-controlled deal either. Nope. This gate was hand-built, pure sweat, wood, and stubbornness. A 6-foot, double-swing ranch gate made out of cedar posts and steel reinforcements I welded myself. It wasn't there to look pretty, it was there to keep my cattle where they belonged in the world where it belonged outside. It stood at the edge of my property, right where the gravel road met my pasture. It had been there for years, long before any HOA board ever met in Doug's garage with store-bought muffins and rules about mailbox colors. That gate was mine. When I built it, I remember thinking, this is freedom in a hinge. It was like drawing a line between my land and everyone else's expectations. My little declaration that said, I live by my own terms. But to the HOA? Oh, that gate was public enemy number one. According to them, my unauthorized structure was blocking community access to the shared right-of-way. Whatever that means. They tossed around words like non-compliant, visual inconsistency, and potential liability. I swear, it's like they have a rulebook just for finding ways to ruin your day. Apparently, my hand-built, rustic gate didn't meet their uniform fencing standards. Uniform fencing standards. Yeah, because nothing screams community safety like making sure every piece of wood is painted the exact shade of soulless beige. They even said it interfered with the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. I had to laugh at that one. My ranch sits on the other side of a dusty field half a mile from their nearest picket fence. You can barely see my gate unless you're squinting through binoculars or have way too much free time on your hands. And apparently, they did. So one Saturday morning, I'm out there fixing a fence line, and I notice 2 HOA board members parked by my gate. They're both wearing reflective vests, clipboards in hand, like they're inspecting a construction site. I walked over and said, "You folks lost or just sightseeing?" One of them, a lady named Carol, looks up from her clipboard and says, "We're here to document a violation." Violation? I asked. You mean this? I gave the gate a pat. It's been here since before your houses even had roofs. Carol adjusted her sunglasses like she was about to lecture me. That may be, sir, but it's now part of a shared access route. All fencing and gates must comply with HOA standards. And that's when I realized they weren't here to talk. They were here to win. I told them straight, this is my land, my gate, my livestock. This isn't your jurisdiction. Carol smirked and said, "You'll need to submit an architectural modification request." I laughed so hard I almost dropped my pliers. Architectural what? It's a gate, not a guest house. She didn't find that funny. Doug, their fearless leader, sent another letter 2 days later, this one with bold text and highlighted paragraphs about potential daily fines. That was the moment I knew the gate had become more than a gate. It was a line in the sand, or in my case, the gravel. To them, it was an eyesore. To me, it was independence with a latch. I mean, come on, I wasn't out here running a theme park. I wasn't blocking anyone's driveway or throwing raves in my pasture. I just wanted to keep my cows from wandering into suburbia and eating someone's decorative bushes. But in HOA land, logic doesn't count. Only rules. And not even the sensible kind, just the kind that make you wonder if they're bored or power hungry. So yeah, that gate started it all. It stood for freedom, for ownership, for the simple right to mind my own business on my own land. Apparently, though, it also stood for rebellion in their eyes. And like every good rebellion story, this one was about to get messy. If I ever write a horror movie, it's gonna start with a white envelope. Because that's how this nightmare began one boring Tuesday, with a letter that looked innocent enough. I pull it from the mailbox, right? No fancy logo, just a plain envelope. But as soon as I open it, bam! There it was. The HOA's first official compliance notice. The thing was written like a love letter from a robot. All stiff and dramatic. Dear homeowner, you are in violation of Article 7, Section 3 of the Community Uniform Property Standard Policy. Like, come on. I'm not even part of your community.
It went on to say my unauthorized gate was impeding community access and must be removed immediately to restore harmony to the neighborhood.
Restore harmony. Yeah, because nothing says harmony like threatening letters from strangers who think beige is a personality. I tossed it aside at first. Figured it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous volunteer just got my name mixed up with someone else's. But nope, a week later, another letter showed up. And this time, it came with fines.
They said I'd owe $100 per day until the obstruction was removed. $100 a day for a gate that's been sitting there longer than their welcome signs.
That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was a campaign.
Now, every rancher knows persistence. You deal with weather, broken fences, coyotes, you learn to stand your ground.
But HOA persistence? That's a whole different species. They sent letter after letter, each one a little more aggressive than the last. One even accused me of interfering with community safety. Safety.
As if my old cedar gate was plotting against the suburbs.
By the fourth letter, I was getting sarcastic about it. I'd read them out loud at breakfast like morning entertainment.
Dear violator, your gate poses a risk to residents' sense of order.
Well, honey, I'd say to myself, we can't have order without beige fences and fear, now can we?
Then came the legal threats. They said if I didn't comply, they'd pursue remedies through small claims court.
That one actually made me laugh out loud.
Imagine walking into court and saying, Your Honor, this man's gate hurts our feelings.
But what really got me wasn't just the letters, it was the gossip.
Apparently, word spread through the subdivision that the rancher at the end of the road was defying the HOA.
Some of the neighbors started looking at me like I was a local outlaw. A few of them actually liked it. I'd be at the feed store, and a guy from one of the nearby houses would nod and whisper, Heard you're taking on the HOA, good for you, man. But others?
Oh, they took Doug's side. They'd drive by slow, shake their heads, like I was out there painting the sky the wrong color. And speaking of Doug, this was around the time I finally met him face to face. Picture this, a man in his 50s, perfectly ironed polo shirt, wearing aviators like he's about to direct traffic on a runway. He pulls up in a golf cart, engine humming like a mosquito, and parks right at my gate.
Morning, I say, polite enough. He doesn't even return the greeting.
Just folds his arms and stares at my gate like it personally insulted his mother. You've received several notices, he says. You're in clear violation of HOA policy. I told him, Doug, my land isn't part of your HOA.
That road's been private since the 70s.
He smiles, that fake, customer service smile that doesn't reach his eyes.
Well, the board disagrees. We'll continue our enforcement until the issue is resolved. I said, resolved how?
He replied, when the gate's gone. Now, I'm not a violent guy, but if sarcasm were a weapon, Doug wouldn't have made it off my property. I told him, Doug, I hand-built this gate. If you want it gone, you're gonna have to explain to my cows why they're suddenly free range again.
He didn't think that was funny either.
He just wrote something on his clipboard, because of course he had one, and drove off, probably to report to his beige army.
That's when it hit me, this wasn't going to stop on its own. They weren't just being annoying, they were trying to wear me down. Paper by paper, threat by threat. And for a second, I thought about giving in. Thought maybe I should just take down the gate and be done with it. But then I looked at that thing, the weathered wood, the hand-welded hinges, the stubborn way it stood no matter how many storms hit it. That gate had more backbone than half the HOA board combined. So I decided, fine. You want a fight? You got one. Because if they thought a few letters could scare me off my own land.
They clearly never met a rancher before.
You ever wake up, step outside, and just know something's wrong? That morning felt like that.
Still, quiet, too quiet. Even the cows were acting weird, gathered near the fence line, staring down the road like they'd seen a ghost.
At first, I thought maybe a coyote got through again.
But as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't a coyote that broke in, it was someone who'd broken something else.
My gate was gone. Just gone. No hinges. No posts. No chain. Not even a tire track left behind. It was like it had been erased from existence overnight. For a second, I honestly thought maybe I was still dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, blinked a few times, nope. My handmade, sweat and blood gate was missing. Then I saw the real problem, my cattle. Half of them had wandered out through the open road, just moseying down like tourists in a new town. A couple were already halfway to the subdivision, grazing on what I think used to be someone's award-winning lawn. My stomach dropped. I sprinted down the road in my boots, waving my hat, yelling like a madman, trying to herd them back. Took me nearly an hour to round everyone up. By the end, I was sweating, fuming, and still standing there with one burning question: who took my gate? I didn't have to wonder long. On the fence post where the gate used to hang, there was a piece of paper stapled like some kind of victory flag. I tore it off, and sure enough, it was from the HOA. Notice of enforcement action: unauthorized structure removed for non-compliance with community access regulations. Costs of removal will be billed accordingly. I swear, my blood pressure went from 0 to fireworks. They took my gate. Without permission. Without warning. Without even the decency to call. Just rolled up onto my property and yanked it out like they owned the place. Thieves with paperwork. I didn't even bother cooling off. I jumped in my truck and drove straight to their little HOA clubhouse, which, by the way, is just a glorified shed with folding chairs and a coffee pot. When I pulled up, there were about 6 of them sitting around a table. Doug, of course, at the head, looking smug as ever. I walked in, holding their notice of enforcement like a wanted poster. Somebody want to explain why you folks came onto my land and took down my gate? Doug didn't even flinch. Sir, we acted in accordance with HOA policy. Policy? I said, stepping closer. Doug, I'm not under your policy. You broke onto private property. He sighed. That fake, patronizing side people do when they think they're the smartest in the room. You were given multiple opportunities to comply. The board made a unanimous decision to resolve the issue directly. Unanimous decision? I said. You don't get to vote on my property, Doug. That's not how land ownership works. Carol, clipboard queen, piped up from the side. Your gate was obstructing a shared access point. Technically, we have jurisdiction. Technically, I shot back, you're trespassing. Doug leaned back in his chair, all calm and self-important. If you believe a mistake was made, you're welcome to file an appeal through our grievance process. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a happy laugh, either. The kind of laugh you do when you're trying not to throw something through a window. Doug, I said, you came onto my land without permission, tore down private property, and now you're telling me to file an appeal? Do you even hear yourself? He just looked at me like I was the crazy one. We're simply enforcing community standards. Let's keep this civil. Civil? I said. Buddy, I was civil until you turned my ranch into a crime scene. By then, a few of the board members were shifting uncomfortably. One older guy muttered something about maybe overstepping, but Doug shot him a glare that could peel paint. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. Because I knew what I wanted to do, but I also knew that's exactly what Doug wanted. He wanted me angry. Wanted me to blow up so he could call the sheriff and play the victim. So I took a breath, straightened my hat, and said, all right. You took my gate. But I promise you, this isn't over. You messed with the wrong ranch. Then I walked out, calm as a preacher but boiling inside. When I got home, the cows were back behind a makeshift wire I'd strung up. But it didn't feel like home anymore. That gate wasn't just wood and metal, it was a boundary, a piece of me. And now it was gone. As I stood there looking at the empty posts, I made myself a promise: they wanted a fight, and they were about to get one. Only this time, I wouldn't just defend my land. I'd make sure the whole town saw what happens when an HOA crosses a line they can't redraw.
After they took my gate, I stopped acting like a rancher and started acting like a lousy private investigator. Not because I wanted to, because what else are you supposed to do when someone rips something off your property and hands you a stapled note like it's a receipt? First step, paperwork. I spent 3 days in the county records office, which is basically a museum of bad coffee and fluorescent lights. I dug up my deed, the original plat maps, utility easements, and every little scribble they'd filed when the subdivision went in. I photocopied things until my fingers cramped and the clerk started giving me the side eye like I was starting a paper fort. Thing is, paper tells stories if you know how to read it. Lines on a map, little dashed easements, dotted notes in the margins, all that stuff adds up. At first glance it looked like the usual nonsense. Someone wants something, so they write it down and hope the ink scares you into compliance. But then I found a set of engineering notes tucked into a packet of HOA covenants. Nothing dramatic, just a contractor's plan for the subdivision's irrigation system.
I skimmed it and almost spit out my coffee.
There it was, a dashed line labeled existing water main running from my property's well right into the development's common area irrigation loop.
In plain English?
Their sprinklers were drinking from my well.
Not a neighbor's connection, not some county line. My well.
I sat back in that uncomfortable county chair and laughed.
Not a small laugh, the kind that surprised me.
Because suddenly the whole thing looked less like a crusade against an ugly gate and more like a classic backyard power play. They'd been using my water to keep their yards green and tidy, probably never even sent me a bill.
Meanwhile, I got a letter calling my gate a menace to public safety.
So I called the water company. Not the municipal water people, the well guy who drilled my well years ago and knows every pipe on my place.
He came out with his truck and a toolbox like a plumber sheriff.
We traced the line together, crawling through sagebrush and prying open old valve boxes. The pipe ran from my pump house, under the old service road, then into the subdivision's irrigation main. There were splices and fittings and a little brass tag someone had stamped with an engineer's number.
Whoever installed it had done it neat, like they'd done this kind of thing before. Next, I pulled up past HOA minutes.
Turns out they'd had meetings where they talked about existing infrastructure and cost efficiencies, notes where nobody seemed to think to mention asking the landowner.
Or paying him. Or, saying thank you. I started talking to neighbors, too.
A few were sheepish, others defensive. One of the early homeowners, the one with the perfect lawn and the perfectly trimmed pride, admitted to having seen the pipes when they installed a mailbox a while back.
We thought it was county, he said. We assumed. Another couple told me Doug had waved away questions like it was a simple administrative oversight. We trusted the board, they said, like that made it okay. By the time I left that day, my head was full of numbers and a funny new kind of plan. They'd thought they could bully me with letters, fines, and a contractor. They didn't count on paperwork and old wells and a stubborn rancher who knows how to read a map. I remember looking at the remaining posts where the gate had been. The sun was low and everything looked golden soft, the kind of light that makes decisions feel righteous. I smiled, slow and satisfied. They took my gate? I muttered to myself, running a thumb over the grain of one post. Oh, they're about to learn what happens when you bite the hand that waters you. Not literal violence, I'm not that kind of man. But leverage. The kind lawyers talk about in fancy words. The kind small-town politics understand in simpler terms. If their irrigation runs on my pump, then their beautiful green lawns, their community events, their little beige empire, all depended on something on my land. So I started making notes. Who installed the line? Which HOA meeting approved the irrigation plan? How long the pipe had been there? What the county records said about easements and access. I put together a folder that would make even Doug's clipboard blush. By the end of the week I'd gone from feeling like a victim to feeling like a strategist. I'd built fences, fixed roofs, calmed a dozen rampaging animals. This was just another fix, except instead of fence wire, I was using facts. Instead of a wrench, I was using records. And instead of yelling at someone to get off my property, I was about to make sure everyone noticed that they were standing on borrowed water. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is nothing at all.
After I found out their sprinklers were basically freeloading off my well, I could have stormed their clubhouse, grabbed a wrench, and pulled every pipe I could reach.
Drama would have been satisfying. But drama ain't strategy. So I played it cool.
First rule, don't look angry in public.
Anger makes people shore up. Calm makes them slip. So I smiled. A lot.
I smiled at the mail carrier. I smiled at the guy trimming the HOA hedges. I even smiled at Doug, which felt weird, like offering a handshake to a rattlesnake. I started showing up in places I'd never normally be: board meetings, coffee with neighbors, the little community market where someone always seemed to have a complaint about raccoons. I told them I wanted to understand their perspective. Which, honestly, was mostly code for watch and listen. HOA meetings are funny if you don't take them personally. They're like town hall theater where everyone thinks they're the lead. People file in with binders, agendas, and casseroles.
Doug ran the meeting like a drill sergeant with a clipboard.
He spoke in confident, clipped sentences and used phrases like maintaining community standards and following due process. Folks nodded like the phrases were religious scripture. I sat near the back, hat low, pretending to scribble notes in a battered notebook. But really, I was watching faces. Watching who interrupted, who backed Doug up, who shifted when someone asked about the irrigation budget. I learned where the soft spots were: who was too proud to admit they'd actually seen pipes crossing the road, who wanted to avoid a lawsuit, who voted yes because they trusted whoever poured the coffee.
I recorded the meeting.
Legally. That line's important. I checked the state rules first. Some places let you record if one person in the conversation, which, in a public HOA meeting, usually includes you, consents. So I pumped my phone into record mode and placed it on the table like an innocent paperweight. The tape was grainy with coughs and shuffling chairs, but it had the goods: references to existing infrastructure, a contractor's name, minutes that mentioned cost savings and connectivity to existing wells.
Little admissions. Little crumbs. Between meetings, I kept up the friendly act.
I helped an elderly neighbor fix a broken fence post, partly because she needed help and partly because she owed me a favor now. I brought muffins to a community potluck and pretended to be fascinated by a slideshow about law narration. I laughed at Doug's jokes, even when they were terrible. It's funny how quickly people let guards down when you're the smiling man who brings snacks. All the while, I was quietly building a file. Pictures, copies of county records I'd pulled earlier, the recorded meeting, statements from neighbors who were willing to talk off the record, and a timeline that showed exactly when the irrigation line was installed and how long they'd been siphoning from my well. I labeled everything, tabbed it, and made a folder so tidy it could be featured in a stationery catalog. There were moments where my poker face almost slipped. At one meeting, Doug started talking about responsibility and shared amenities, and I felt my jaw twitch. But I kept my voice pleasant.
I hear you, I said. Let's figure this out together.
Inside, I was cooking up options: legal, logistical, and, if need be, public.
Why keep it secret? Because leverage works only when it's a surprise. If you whisper your next move, people have time to prepare. If you flash your hand too early, you lose the advantage. So I fed them just enough cooperation to seem reasonable, while behind the scenes I was doing everything a sensible man does when he's about to change the score: documenting, confirming, and lining up allies. One neighbor, Megan, surprised me. Quiet, mid-50s, with a green thumb that made her backyard look like a botanical exhibit, she slipped me a printout after a meeting. "I saw what happened to your gate," she said. "You didn't deserve it."
She'd been at the subdivision when the irrigation was installed and was suddenly willing to put her name to it.
Small things like that add up.
At home, the replacement fence I'd rigged held, but the empty space where the gate had been felt like a bruise.
So I paced. I double-checked my notes.
I called the well guy for a technical read on how easy it would be to temporarily disable the flow if I needed to, not to harm, just to show consequence. He hemmed and hawed but admitted it was doable with a lockable valve. That tidbit went into the maybe column of my plan.
Playing it cool feels like doing nothing, but it's not. It's preparation with a slow smile. It's letting them believe they've won the morning while you map out the afternoon.
People think heat wins battles, more often it's patience.
By the time I left that last meeting, I wasn't just calm. I was ready.
The board thought they'd broken something important. They'd done that, but they'd also lit the match that would make their little beige world notice how dependent it was on a rancher they'd pushed too far.
Let them enjoy their lawn while it lasts. There's a difference between being mad and being effective. Anger makes you shout. Strategy makes people listen.
After weeks of smiling, recording, and filing pretty folders, it was time to trade my jokes for something with teeth.
First thing I did was call a lawyer.
Not some TV lawyer with a catchphrase, but a local land use attorney who still remembers what a handshake means. I walked into his office with my stack of papers, deeds, plats, the engineering notes, the HOA minutes, the recording of the meeting where Doug casually mentioned existing infrastructure. He poured coffee, glanced through the stuff, and didn't raise his eyebrows at me once. That's the sign of a professional, your mess becomes their job. He explained things in plain language, which I appreciated. Long story short, if the water line's on my property and there's no recorded easement or written permission, the HOA's use of it is, let's call it unauthorized. There were a few routes we could take: demand they pay for a formal easement, seek damages for unauthorized use, or ask the court for injunctive relief to stop their continued use until the matter was resolved. In other words, we could make them stop legally, not theatrically.
I liked legal. Legal is clean.
Legal makes people who love rules squirm. It's the kind of thing that strips the swagger right out of a clipboard.
So we filed a notice.
Not a threatening, all-caps manifesto, but a crisp, lawyer-typed claim: the HOA's irrigation infrastructure crosses private property without consent and constitutes unauthorized use of water and utilities. The filing included maps, timestamps, and copies of the meeting minutes where the board discussed cost efficiencies, minutes that suddenly look like confessions under a spotlight. The lawyer also sent a letter that said, in Kinder legalese, cease and desist unauthorized use of private water infrastructure, or pursue remedies available under state code. Translation: stop drinking my water or have a judge make you stop. I liked watching the paper do the heavy lifting.
But I didn't rush to sabotage anything.
That's important to say loud. I didn't go out there with bolt cutters or a crowbar. That would have been dumb, and it would have handed them exactly the headline they wanted: rancher vandalizes community water line.
Instead, I prepared options that a court would respect.
We documented the exact point where their line tied into my pump system, took photos, and even had the well guy draw up a service report showing the connections and flow.
All of it went into the file.
Then we discussed leverage.
The law gives you tools if you're willing to use them.
One option was to seek an immediate temporary restraining order or injunction that would legally prevent the HOA from using the line until the dispute was resolved.
Another was to negotiate a paid easement, a formal agreement where they compensate me for use and maintenance.
Either way, the message was clear: their green lawns were riding on my goodwill.
And goodwill doesn't last forever when it's taken for granted.
I tell you this not to brag, but because there's something satisfying about watching bureaucracy meet bureaucracy.
Doug likes to throw around words like enforcement and compliance. Fine.
I speak compliance too, but it's compliance with the law, not with a man who thinks a clipboard makes him a monarch. Still, I wanted them to feel the seriousness of it without me doing anything rash. So we set the pieces in motion: the formal filings, the certified letters, and a neutral engineer's assessment that could be presented in court. I even made sure to give them a reasonable deadline to either secure an easement and pay for past usage or agree to stop using the line.
Public pressure helps, too.
Once the HOA realized this could become a legal and PR problem, imagine the newsletter headline: community toilets on rancher's dime. Their smugness started to crack. There was a small, private moment that made me grin. While the lawyer was drafting the filings, I sent a short, clipped email to Doug: nothing inflammatory, just facts and the same map that made my jaw drop when I first saw it.
You may want to consult counsel, it said. If he'd ever loved his beige empire, that sentence was the cold bucket of water it needed. But I kept everything professional. I didn't threaten. I didn't plan sabotage. I planned leverage.
The kind that comes from knowledge, records, and the willingness to let law do the work. If they wanted to keep watering their azaleas, they were going to have to do it on paper and probably with a checkbook. I like the way it sounded in my head. If they think they own everything past my fence, wait till they realize where their sprinklers drink from. That line felt poetic and true.
It wasn't about cruelty. It was about consequence. They'd taken my gate like it was insignificant.
I was going to show them what happens when you make someone reliant on a resource you don't own and then try to deny them any say over it. By the time the deadline and the letter passed, their board started to look nervous. There were emergency meetings.
Quiet phone calls. 1 or 2 neighbors stopped me in the feed store with anxious looks and muttered, "You didn't have to go that far, did you?"
I smiled and said nothing. Legal is an odd kind of mercy, it forces people to fix what they broke.
So I waited. Calm. Collected. Ready.
The gate was gone, sure, but the fight had changed. It wasn't about timber and hinges anymore. It was about water, rights, and the small dignity of owning a thing somebody else thought they could use without asking.
And the best part? The next move wasn't mine to make. It belonged to the law. And that, my friends, is a very patient kind of thunder. There's a special kind of peace that comes from flipping a switch and knowing the world on the other end of it has no idea what's coming. No drama, no shouting, just a quiet, steady click that sets a chain of events in motion. That's exactly how the morning started. Cool breeze, sun coming up over the hills, coffee in hand.
And me, standing beside the well shed, checking pressure gauges and valve settings one last time.
Everything legal, everything documented.
My lawyer had confirmed it twice. I was fully within my rights to restrict access to the line that crossed my land.
I wasn't cutting anything, wasn't destroying property. I was simply turning off my tap. And so, I did.
With a small twist of the handle, the steady hum faded. The pipes gave one last hiss, and then silence.
Somewhere half a mile away, those HOA sprinklers were about to have the worst Monday of their lives. At first, nothing happened. You don't notice missing water immediately. It takes time.
But by that afternoon, I drove past the neighborhood entrance and spotted a couple of homeowners standing around the big stone fountain, the one that usually gurgled like it thought it was Versailles.
Now,
it was coughing air bubbles. By evening, the green patches along the sidewalks looked thirsty. The HOA prided itself on those lawns, perfectly mowed, all the same shade of artificial-looking green. They even gave out monthly Yard of the Month signs, like it was some suburban Olympics. But now, those emerald carpets were fading faster than a spray tan in a thunderstorm.
The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Emails, calls, voicemails, all from HOA addresses.
At first, polite, "Dear Mr. Turner, it appears we're experiencing a disruption in our irrigation system.
Are you aware of any issues?"
Then, not so polite, "Mr. Turner, we've been informed that your property contains the well infrastructure feeding our community systems.
If you have taken action to restrict water flow, this is a violation of."
I didn't even finish reading that one.
Instead, I sent a simple, formal response through my lawyer's office.
Since the HOA determined that my gate was unauthorized and required removal, I assumed my well water, also on my private property, was similarly unauthorized. Access has therefore been suspended pending proper agreement and documentation.
It was polite, professional, and pure poetry. The irony hit them hard.
The same people who tore out my hand-built gate because it didn't fit their community standards were now begging for access to the very water that kept their little kingdom looking pretty. The president, Doug, naturally, tried calling me directly. Left a voicemail that started calm but ended sounding like he'd swallowed a lemon. Something about community reliance, mutual benefit, and urgent restoration.
I let it sit.
I figured he'd appreciate the silence. It'd give him time to reflect. By midweek, the place looked like a desert movie set.
Brown patches spread like wildfire, and that fountain at the entrance? Bone dry. The HOA's landscapers showed up with portable water tanks, trying to hand water the flower beds. It was almost sad. Almost. Meanwhile, my pastures were fine. My cattle had water, my crops were steady,
and I still had that same peaceful morning coffee. You could say balance had been restored, at least on my side of the fence. I even drove through the subdivision that Friday. Just a little loop, slow enough to enjoy the view. Doug was out front, hands on his hips, staring at the dead grass like it had personally betrayed him. I gave him a friendly wave. He didn't wave back. Later that evening, another letter arrived. This one had a tone shift, no more threats, just negotiation. We would like to discuss a mutually beneficial solution regarding the water source. Finally, they'd found humility. Amazing what dehydration can do for diplomacy. My lawyer drafted a reply outlining terms, a formal easement, fair compensation for past usage, coverage for maintenance costs, and written acknowledgement that all previous violations, including the so-called unauthorized gate, would be voided. That was the deal. They'd get their water back, and I'd get my dignity, legally restored and notarized. Funny thing, though, before signing, Doug asked if we could turn the water back on in good faith. My lawyer smiled across the table and said, "Water flows when respect does." We got the signatures the next morning. And when I finally opened that valve again, the sound of rushing water filled the pipes like music. Not because I missed them, but because it meant the score was settled. They took my gate, I took their water. Fair trade if you ask me. And as I watched the gauge pressure rise, I couldn't help but grin. Revenge doesn't always come with fireworks or yelling matches. Sometimes it comes with a soft click of a valve and the sound of sprinklers gasping back to life, knowing every drop now flows on your terms. The morning after the water went dry, things went from slightly inconvenient to full-blown suburban apocalypse. You'd think someone had pulled the plug on civilization. Sprinklers coughed, lawns crisped, and those fancy flower beds the HOA bragged about in their newsletters? Toasted. Literally. The roses by the clubhouse looked like burnt cornflakes. By midweek, Doug, our fearless HOA president, had called what he dramatically titled an emergency community response meeting. You'd think it was a hurricane, not a water shutoff. Flyers went out, neighbors texted each other in panic, and I swear, one lady was out there filling her birdbath with bottled water from Costco. Now, I didn't go to that first meeting, but a friend of mine did. She said it was chaos from the start. Doug stood at the front in his salmon pink polo, clutching a clipboard like a life raft, and tried to sound authoritative. "Residents," he said, "we are currently dealing with a situation caused by one individual who has unlawfully interrupted the community's irrigation supply." You could almost hear the pitchforks sharpening. People started shouting. "What do you mean one individual? Who did this? My lawn's dead." Doug cleared his throat. "Did that fake smile thing people do when they're losing control. The water source is located on private property adjacent to our subdivision. Unfortunately, the property owner." And that's when the crowd lost it. "Wait, you mean his property?" someone yelled. "That rancher guy? Why was the community's water on his land to begin with?" another shouted. Doug stammered, waving his clipboard like it could deflect accountability. "It's, part of an established system. It's always been there." That's when my friend told me the line that made me grin for a week straight. "Then maybe it always shouldn't have been," one resident said, arms crossed. That's when the tide turned. The panic wasn't directed at me anymore, it was aimed squarely at the HOA board. By the next day, word had spread faster than weeds on a broken sprinkler line. Residents were comparing old HOA budgets, reading bylaws, and, here's the fun part, digging through property records. Turns out, some of them had a cousin or friend in the county office. And wouldn't you know it? No legal easement. No permission. No record that the HOA ever had rights to use my well. Doug must have been sweating through that pastel polo. Because when people realized they'd been paying HOA dues to maintain landscaping that was fed by someone else's private water without consent, things got ugly. The next emergency meeting was even better. This time, I did attend. Sat in the back, quiet, hat low, just sipping coffee like a spectator at a slow-motion train wreck. Doug started the meeting with that forced, overly calm tone, "We're working diligently with legal counsel to resolve our water issue." Someone from the crowd yelled, "You mean the water you stole?" Another chimed in, "You said it was community infrastructure, it's not even on community land." A third added, "So you tore down his gate, used his well, and now you want to sue him? That's not leadership, Doug, that's lunacy." I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost. When someone asked if the HOA could actually sue me, Doug said, "Our attorneys are reviewing possible actions." To which an older resident stood up and said, "Doug, if you sue him, you'll be suing the man who owns the water our entire neighborhood depends on." That doesn't sound smart. You could have heard a pin drop. That's when I decided to speak. Calmly. Respectfully. I stood up and said, "Look, folks. I'm not here to fight anyone. I didn't touch their system. I didn't cut a single pipe. I just closed the valve on my land. The same land they said I wasn't allowed to put a gate on." Silence. Then, from the middle row, someone muttered, "So, they took your gate and then used your water?" I nodded. Pretty much. A ripple of laughter went through the room. And then applause. Real applause. Doug tried to regain control, but it was too late. The narrative had flipped. The big bad rancher wasn't the villain anymore, he was the guy standing up to power, the one everyone secretly wished they had the guts to be. By the end of that week, residents were demanding a full audit of the HOA's finances, questioning every decision Doug and his board had made. The landscaper contracts, the fines, the gate removals, all of it suddenly looked shady under the microscope of public outrage. Emails leaked. Turns out, the board had known for years that the water line technically crossed private property. They just never thought it'd matter. One neighbor stopped me at the feed store and said, "Man, you didn't just turn off the water, you drained the HOA's power, too." And that, right there, was the truth. The lawns would grow back eventually. The flowers could be replanted. But the trust those board members lost? That was gone for good. Doug's kingdom of clipboards and bylaws had finally sprung a leak, and this time, there was no fixing it with a fine notice. There's an old saying I once heard from a fence builder, "A good line keeps the peace." He meant property lines, of course, but after everything that happened, I realized it applies to people too. You cross the wrong line, and sooner or later, you pay for it. By the time the HOA meltdown settled into stunned silence, the lawyers had taken center stage. My guy, the calm, sharp land use attorney I'd hired, was practically humming. He loved this kind of case, clean facts, solid documentation, and an HOA that had written its own confession one angry email at a time. Doug and his board, on the other hand, looked like they'd been chewed up and spit out by a paper shredder. The residents weren't buying their excuses anymore, and the threat of a lawsuit had everyone suddenly acting polite. The HOA's attorney reached out first, always a good sign. The message was simple: they wanted to negotiate. Fine by me. I didn't need drama anymore. I had a ranch to run. So we met at the lawyer's office, a neutral ground, all polite smiles and dry coffee. On one side of the table sat me and my attorney. On the other, Doug, two board members, and a lawyer who looked like she billed by the syllable. My attorney started off calm. "We're not here for revenge," he said. "We're here for resolution. The HOA used our client's private water system without authorization, and they removed his gate without due process or legal authority. We're simply asking for fairness, reimbursement, restoration, and written acknowledgement." Doug cleared his throat, pretending like he hadn't spent the last few weeks dodging pitchforks at community meetings. "We didn't realize the well and the lines were privately owned," he said, avoiding eye contact. It's always been that way." My lawyer nodded. "That's exactly the problem. It's always been that way, illegally." The HOA's attorney tried to soften the blow. "Perhaps there's room for mutual understanding here." I smiled, leaned back, and said, "Sure. I understand they owe me for 10 years of free irrigation." The silence that followed was beautiful. When all the paperwork smoke cleared, the agreement looked something like this. The HOA formally acknowledged that the water infrastructure crossed private property and had been used without written consent. They agreed to reimburse me for the estimated cost of that unauthorized use plus damages for the removed gate. They also covered legal fees, because apparently, justice doesn't water itself. And, most importantly, they issued a written statement, not quite an apology, but close enough to frame. It admitted they'd acted beyond their authority in the removal of my property.
The cherry on top?
Doug, Mr. Clipboard King himself, voluntarily stepped down as HOA president. The official newsletter said he wanted to spend more time with family. Translation: he got voted out faster than a gopher at a garden party. When word spread around the neighborhood, the mood shifted again. Folks who'd avoided me before suddenly waved when I drove past.
Some even stopped by to thank me.
"You didn't just win for yourself," one neighbor said.
"You reminded them they can't bully people with bylaws." It felt good. Not smug, not petty. Just right.
I used part of the settlement money to rebuild the gate better this time. Solid steel frame, cedar panels, heavy hinges, and a locking latch that'd outlive us all. On the top beam, I burned a small line of words with a branding iron.
Respect the line.
Not a threat, not a warning, just a reminder.
As for the HOA?
They're still around, just quieter now. The new board learned their lesson: stay in your lane, check your maps, and maybe don't mess with the rancher next door.
My lawyer sent me one last email after the case wrapped up. "Pleasure doing business with you," it said.
"You handled this better than most folks would have."
I wrote back, "Nah. I just played by their rules, for once." And that was the truth.
See, revenge feels good for a minute. But justice, clean, legal, undeniable justice, that sticks.
It's the kind of satisfaction that doesn't fade when the laughter does.
So I sat on my porch that evening, gate closed, cattle fed, sun dropping low across the pasture. I listened to the wind through the grass and thought about how simple it all could have been if they'd just left that gate alone. They thought they could take what was mine without asking. But in the end, they learned the most important rule of all.
If you don't respect the line will remind you who it belongs to.
There's something deeply satisfying about rebuilding something that was taken from you, not just to replace it, but to remind everyone why it mattered in the first place. The day I started putting up the new gate, the sun was sharp and golden, the kind of morning that smells like cedar and fresh dirt. The ranch was quiet except for the steady rhythm of hammer and hinge. Piece by piece, I rebuilt what the HOA thought they could erase, only this time, I wasn't just putting up a gate.
I was putting up a statement.
The new design was sturdy steel frame, weatherproofed wood, heavy latches that clicked like a safe door. I didn't buy it pre-made, I built it myself, just like the first one. But this time, I added a few upgrades.
Reinforced posts sunk deep into concrete. Double swing panels wide enough for the tractor. Even a keypad lock, just because I could. And right across the top beam, carved with my own hands, were the words: "Authorized by common sense." When I stood back to look at it, I couldn't help but laugh.
It was more than just a fence line now, it was a monument to every homeowner who'd ever had to fight a battle they never asked for.
The funny thing? The neighborhood didn't look at me the same way anymore. For months, folks had been giving me those sideways glances, the kind that say, "That's the guy who took on the HOA." But now, those same people slowed down when they drove past. They waved. Some even stopped by to compliment the gate. One neighbor, a guy who used to avoid eye contact at the feed store, leaned on his truck door and said, "That's one fine-looking gate, Turner. Glad to see it back where it belongs." "Yeah," I said, grinning. "This one's HOA approved by nature herself." Even the new HOA president, a soft-spoken woman named Linda, drove up one afternoon in her little hybrid SUV. She got out, smiled nervously, and said, "I just wanted to introduce myself and to say, we're sorry for how things were handled before." I nodded. "Appreciate that." She went on, "We've updated the bylaws, by the way. Property boundaries are now strictly respected, and no board member can authorize action without written consent from the owner." I couldn't help but chuckle. That's probably a good rule to keep around. She smiled, glanced at the new gate, and said, "Nice work. Very symbolic." Symbolic. Yeah, that's the word. Because the truth was, this gate wasn't just a door to my land, it was closure.
It stood for every hour I'd spent buried in paperwork, every sarcastic letter, every sleepless night wondering what they'd pull next. Now it stood strong and silent, right where it belonged. The peace that followed was different from before. Not the kind of peace that comes from pretending everything's fine, but the kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground and came out the other side with your dignity intact. Weeks went by, and life fell back into rhythm. The cattle grazed, the fences held, the sprinklers down in the subdivision hummed quietly, this time, with proper paperwork and payment attached. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings, coffee or beer in hand, watching the sun dip behind the gate. The air would cool, the fields would hum with crickets, and I'd feel that old sense of calm I'd been chasing since I bought this land.
Some folks fight to win. Me? I fought to be left alone, and that was victory enough. There's a comfort in knowing the line's been redrawn, not in anger but in respect. The new board sends polite letters now, actual letters, not threats. And when they need something, they ask first. Which, in my book, is the difference between neighbors and nuisances. Every so often, I catch someone slowing down to snap a picture of the gate. Maybe they like the craftsmanship, or maybe they just appreciate the irony. Either way, I don't mind. Let it be a little landmark, a quiet reminder that common sense still has a place out here, even among property lines and power trips. As I locked up one night, I ran my hand along the top beam and smiled. The wood was still smooth, the letters still clear. Authorized by common sense. That's all it ever took, really, just a bit of sense. And with the gate closed, the stars out, and the land finally at peace, I could finally say, not just with pride, but with calm certainty, that this chapter was over. You know, when this whole thing started, I thought it was just about a gate. A few planks of wood, a couple of hinges, and a patch of land I worked hard to call my own. But by the time the dust settled, I realized it was never just about the gate, it was about control. It's funny how small power can twist people up. Give someone a clipboard, a title, and a set of rules, and suddenly they think they're running a kingdom. That's the danger of unchecked authority, it creeps in slow, wearing the mask of order and community standards. And before you know it, someone's telling you how high your grass can grow or what color your gate should be. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission because that's what they'd always done. Most folks just pay the fine, repaint the fence, and move on. But here's the truth, if you don't push back, people like that never stop pushing. What I learned through all this is pretty simple, you can't rely on common sense to be common anymore. You've got to know your rights, document everything, and stand your ground with both feet planted. Because at the end of the day, your property isn't just dirt and lumber, it's your peace of mind, your hard work, your little corner of freedom. And let me tell you, nothing makes a bully stumble faster than a calm person with receipts. If I'd yelled, they would have painted me as the problem. If I'd broken something, they would have called the sheriff. But by staying steady, by using the law, the facts, and a little patience, I let them dig their own hole. And they fell right into it, paper trail and all. There were moments I almost gave up. Days when I thought, maybe I should just let them have it, it's not worth the fight. But every time I drove past that empty spot where my gate used to be, it reminded me why I started this. It wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. Now, the land's quiet again. The new gate's standing proud, and even the HOA learned a bit of humility. The lawns down there are green again, but this time, they're watered with permission. Funny how things balance out when you stop letting people walk all over your boundaries. I guess that's the real lesson here, if you don't defend your fence line, someone else will move it for you. People ask me sometimes if it was worth all the trouble. Every meeting, every letter, every ounce of frustration. And I tell them, absolutely. Because the moment I rebuilt that gate, I wasn't just reclaiming my property, I was reclaiming my peace. So if you're ever in a fight like this, whether it's a nosy neighbor, an overzealous HOA, or just someone who can't mind their own business, remember this, stay calm, stay smart, and stay true to what's yours. And when the moment comes, don't be afraid to draw your line, literally or figuratively, and make it clear, respect isn't optional. Because they can take your gate, your fence, your sleep, but they can't take your ground if you know where you stand. And as for me? Well, they took my gate thinking they owned the road. But I reminded them who owned the water beneath it. Fade out. Soft guitar strumming. sunset over the ranch. Text on screen.